Welcome back, everyone, to the Madness and Grace podcast. Today, it is your usual hosts, me and Matt. No guests today, so Matt and I are just going to kind of go back and forth on the topic of religious trauma, which I know is a touchy subject. And a lot of times I pick what we want to talk about based off of, my own personal experience, people in my life who have struggled with different things related to mental health, and religious trauma, unfortunately, is something that is prevalent and happens, and it can really turn people away from, the church and faith. I think there's a lot of guilt and shame that comes with religious trauma. It's less likely, but a lot of times there can be abuse, manipulation, or just kind of ostracism from a religious community. And then after all of that, you're kind of just, well, I don't even want to be a part of a church anymore. I don't want to be a part of a religious group. If you listen to the podcast, Matt and I talk all the time about how beneficial it can be to be a part of a church and be a part of a community. So we just wanted to talk about this today. And sorry, Matt, I kind of steamrolled over, but how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. No, I like that introduction. I like the topic. It's unfortunately a topic that we run into quite often in the Hope and Healing Center. And, I think that, a lot of things could be defined as trauma. I kind of see three main areas that at least I run into quite a bit. One would be where a religious leader in a church has literally abused someone. They have sexually assaulted them or taken advantage of them in a physical way like that. So we see and hear about that quite a bit. And obviously that could be put into the context of religious trauma. And then we have in another area, we could say, a faith community focusing on some aspect of an individual, like say, for instance, that they have a mental illness or their family member has a mental illness or whatever that might be. And then, as you said, ostracizing them, kind of shaming them, pushing them out. I'll give an example in a minute of a family that I dealt with that had that issue. And then I think the last one that I run into quite a bit is where a faith leader or a faith community kind of uses God or the characteristics of how they see God as kind of a hammer to kind of manipulate or control people. And they kind of taught people that God is kind of this angry, punitive, you better follow a certain set of rules. And if you don't, God won't love you, and we won't love you. We won't have anything to do with you. So they kind of use religion as kind of as a weapon. I think the overarching thing we need to understand, or someone needs to understand when they're talking about religious trauma, is that, a lot of these things can just happen in the general public as well. But when you're talking about a faith community, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, a faith community and the leaders of that faith community represent God to people. And so when they traumatize you, when they abuse you, when they hurt you, there's a deeper kind of psychological context to it than just an individual. It's hard enough to process and deal with an individual human harming you or abusing you or traumatizing you. But when you put it in the context of, in some sense, maybe God did this or allowed this or was involved in this, then it goes to a level where it's very difficult for the person to even conceptualize or process.
Matt, have you witnessed any specific examples of religious trauma? Obviously, you don't have to give names or who they are in your life, but just something that you've seen that maybe people listening can relate to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that really stands out to me is a lot of times one that people they really think I'm making up because it's so horrific. But I was doing a training for pastors. I was training a whole set of pastors from a whole lot of different churches on mental health awareness. And during the question and answer, there was a female pastor there, and she asked me how she could best minister to a brand new family that just had started at her church because they had been hurt so much by the previous church they were at. Their child was about 8 years old and had some pretty significant, mental health, behavioral disorder that caused them to act out. And so the child, acted out in the Sunday school. And so at some point, the child threw a toy and it hit another child and cut the child on the forehead.
Mm.
And so what the church decided to do was the church got a restraining order against the
Oh,
family to keep them from being able to come to the church.
wow.
And so obviously they left, in disgrace and shamed, and now
Mm.
they happily went to another church, but they were very hurt by that. And so, that's that there's all kind of horrible stuff going on there. I mean, I know lots of people with mental health problems that have been told by churches that their mental health problem is a sin and they just need to pray more, and that they're
Mhm.
just a bad person. And I've also known women that were sexually assaulted by pastors and things like that in counseling sessions or taken advantage of. So I mean, it's a broad thing. I think really, any type of trauma that
Mm.
is experienced just in the general population can be experienced obviously in a faith community context. But I think getting back to what I said before, it now has a religious context to it where God is somehow involved. And I've done a lot of research around it. So have others, looking at people's God image
Mm.
and how they view God, what do they think God is like, and then looking at that in relationship to their mental health outcomes. And when people are taught that God is engaged in their life, that's the most important dimension, is engagement. That God is engaged in their life, whether he's more authoritarian and somewhat judgmental, or more benevolent. It doesn't really matter. If he's engaged, then that's very positive, mentally healthy for the individual. But when they're
Mhm.
taught that God is disengaged, not engaged in their life,
Mhm.
particularly if God is not engaged and very judgmental, so that he doesn't care enough to be involved in your life, but he judges you all the time. Those really have very poor mental health outcomes. So you can imagine, if a congregation is being taught that kind of, God is really kind of just this punitive monster who just judges you all the time, but he isn't really involved in your daily life. And then you throw into the context of that shaming and manipulation, and it can be tremendously damaging for an individual. And I don't think, me personally, I don't think that's really the God of the Bible. I don't think that's who Jesus is. I think that God is engaged in your life. God cares for you. Certainly, God has rules and guidelines for living
Mhm.
and for being in relationship with Him. But those are all for our benefit, not for our kind of destruction in some sense. So a lot of times, I think what happens is people get in the way here, and
Yeah.
a pastor, a ministry leader, a lay leader in a church, they a lot of times have a lot of power,
Mhm.
and power can be a very dangerous thing in the hands of a human.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing that you said, that's not who Jesus is. That's not who God is. It's hard to separate the two. So, say someone is like, okay, God, I'm going to go to church and I'm going to, make my life right. And then something really traumatic happens to them, like you just mentioned, a person of power abuses them. It's kind of, they had this trust in God and now they don't. When at the end of the day, it's the people who hurt you. It's not God who was smiting
Right.
down on you.
And that
So
just
it's
be
hard. Yeah, it's hard to just separate the two, I think.
very hard to separate. Particularly if you think, well, this person is a representative of God.
Yeah.
It becomes very difficult to and you've seen pastor, very prominent pastors or clergy, kind of have a fall where they cheating on their wives or involved in some
Yeah.
kind of sexual assault or harassment of women. And I
Mhm.
mean, even they sometimes find it difficult to separate themselves from God, in the sense that they feel almost like they're allowed to do these things, that they
Yeah, they
they
have
have,
the right.
yeah, they have some special level of spirituality or holiness. So it's a difficult thing. Unfortunately, it happens quite a bit. I mean, as far as clergy members assaulting or manipulating women to be involved in sexual relationships with them, or assaulting children, probably the best person that writes around that is Diane Langberg. She's a fantastic psychologist, a world-renowned psychologist that writes about abuse and trauma in the church,
Mhm.
all from a faith perspective. She has some incredible books if you're looking for something like that. I think it's important that people realize, and again, I think people know this to some extent, but it gets lost in the noise. And if anybody is more focused on your performance than they are on caring for you and your kind of heart or emotional relationship connection to God. They're more and they're linking your relationship to them and your relationship to God to performance. I think that's when a lot of times we start to get into these areas. So like with that example I gave you with the child, I mean, I could think of 100 things that would have been a better approach to trying to care for this very distressed family with this child who has this mental health problem, to where we could demonstrate the love of God to this family and really draw them in more closely to their faith, as opposed to literally putting them out for something that isn't their fault, something that isn't the child's fault.
Right.
And so, it's really amazing to imagine that in these contexts we can do such ridiculous things. And so, I see a faith community as a place that should be opened and receptive to all. I mean, that it isn't, that doesn't mean you can be in church leadership necessarily. There's certainly
Right.
criteria for that. That doesn't mean, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily following all the teachings of the church. That, I mean, everybody comes to the church at a different place in their journey. If the church isn't, you just look at the New Testament church. I mean, there's all kind of people coming out of paganism and all types of things there, and they're struggling. And when we try to make it a very kind of sterilized, exclusive club, I think that's when we set ourselves up for these kind of traumatizing things. I think another thing is, and we've seen this more recently. I don't know if you've seen any of this, but when we have these kind of almost a cult of personality kind of thing, where you have a pastor who is tremendously powerful, and almost a celebrity, if not a celebrity. I think again we've set ourselves up for trauma. And we're not here to get on any one particular person. Everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. You make mistakes. So, but the thing is, I mean, I think there are things that we can do to make sure that these things don't happen. And, I think first and foremost, I mean, what is the foundation of our faith? And as Christians, the foundation of our faith is the person of Jesus Christ. And who was Jesus? What was Jesus's character like? What was Jesus's expectation of his followers? What was he trying to teach us about who God was, and what his expectations and wants for our lives were? I mean, I think that's where we begin, but it gets kind of insane sometimes when you see what happens. I think the other thing on the other part of this conversation is what happens if you have been traumatized. I think it's not as easy, honestly, and it's really I don't really have a great answer to that. It's not as easy as just going and finding yourself a good trauma therapist and sitting down, because the reality is you're going to have a conversation about your faith in the context of this trauma. And unfortunately, most therapists are not going to be equipped to have that conversation with you.
That kind of leads into my next question. Obviously, religious trauma, it's probably like any other trauma when seeking, healing and recovering. But how can someone who has been hurt by the church or a faith community or someone in power, how can they heal from the trauma while also wanting to keep their faith, and they still want to be a part of a community, but they're just scared, or, they've been so hurt that it's just hard to navigate finding a new community to be a part of. So are there any tips you would give someone who may be looking to, start fresh somewhere, but they just don't know how?
Yeah, I think on the personal level, I would say you have to keep reminding I mean, even though, this doesn't make the trauma go away, and it doesn't make it hurt any less, but this has to be the foundation from which you begin to kind of recover. And that you have to keep reminding yourself that whoever it was that hurt you in the church, or whatever church it was that hurt you, that is not God. And their view of God, their position on God, their teaching on God may be completely contrary to what God really is like. And so I think you have to remind yourself that I've been hurt, and I've been hurt in a religious context, but that was not God. That was a person that did that. I think secondly, I think the easiest way to begin that process of moving back and healing is to connect with trusting, believing friends. So find yourself a friend or two that is a person of faith that you trust, that you respect, and that's the person that you just begin having conversations with about how you've been hurt and asking the questions, and you're just looking for someone that can listen, but
Yeah.
that is a person that has a similar faith as yours. And then
Mhm.
I think look you have to look for a therapist that is comfortable having the conversation about faith. I mean, we'll tell you this: if a lot of times, as you mentioned at the beginning, if people are hurt within a religious context, they're hurt by a church or a pastor, whoever, a lot of times they'll leave the faith. And whether you've left the faith or not, is going to be absolutely necessary for you to talk about faith in the context of your recovery, or you're not going to be able to move forward. And
Right.
so you're going to have to find a therapist that can have those conversations with you. And then once you begin to do that, then you have to remind yourself again, it wasn't God that did that, and that there are churches out there, there are faith communities out there that are loving and accepting and will be wonderful places for you to be. And you
Yeah.
have to just kind of very carefully begin to look around for them. I mean, I think it's important to remind ourselves that, what Jesus said, that the way people outside the faith would know us is how we love one another.
Mhm.
And I think that is something that we have forgotten.
Straight away
And
from.
we are churches are, they're not communities anymore. And a lot of times people don't even live near the church they go to; they live far away. So the only time they ever see the people on Sunday morning is on Sunday morning. And
Right.
so it's hard to love somebody you never see.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a church that feels accepting, a church that feels loving, a church that feels supportive, and a church that is more interested in your relationship with God on a spiritual level than they are on your performance.
You mentioned a step would be, finding someone to talk to. And also, you have to dive into your faith, whether you've left the faith or not. Obviously, that's not an easy thing to do, to just find a therapist, but, here at HHCI, our biggest resource that we talk about a lot is the Hope Line, where you can get referred out to places of support that kind of match your financial capabilities, all of that stuff. So, of course, I'm going to leave all of that in our show notes.
And I think, a support line
Yeah.
like that, I mean, you bring that up, I think that's a great,
Yeah.
maybe a first step. If you don't
Mm.
feel comfortable talking to a friend,
Yeah.
maybe the friends that you have are at the church, and
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
worried about that. Well, call a support line like the Hope Line.
Hmm.
You can call the Hope Line and be anonymous if you want to, and you can
Yeah.
call back.
Yeah.
Uh,
Call as many times
so,
as you want.
that might give you some, protection for yourself to be able to have some conversations with somebody that's
Mhm.
just there to listen as you begin to kind of talk through some of this stuff for yourself. But
Yeah.
I think the important thing to realize is that there absolutely is recovery. There absolutely is a way back to wholeness. There's a way back to a stronger and deeper faith. You don't have to allow this to completely destroy your faith. Wherever you were, whoever this was, whatever organization this was, that was not a healthy place. And
Mhm.
you're just unfortunately a casualty of that. But there is a way back. There is a way back.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Matt. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to leave all of our resources in the show notes. And I also wanted to mention that here at HHCI, we do a lot of educational programs. And one that kind of pertains to the topic we're talking about, we're going to have a program in February from Dr. Robin Gearing, who's going to be talking about religion and suicide. And then also our own Maddie Stiers is going to have a program about understanding interpersonal violence and spirituality in women in April. So I'm going to leave the links to all of that in our show notes. And then we're also going to have Maddie on our podcast coming up soon, which I'm really excited about. So thank you so much, Matt. And thank you all for listening.